Samia. I'm a politics reporter at Cal Matters. For the past few years, been covering a lot of democracy, representation, how different communities engage with the political system. So very excited to be here with our panelists today. I know you've had some great discussions about voter engagement, the hard work of administering elections, and the limitations of data, as we just heard about. So I'm looking forward to kind of bringing that all together now as we close out and looking ahead at what to expect in November and beyond. So I will start with very brief introductions and then get right into the question. Sure, yes. We have Rosalind Gold with Naleo Educational Fund, which aims to empower Latino communities. We have Luis Sanchez with the Executive Director of Power California, which aims to harness the power of young voters of color. We have Rishma Shamasundar, the Executive Director of Asian American Futures, which tries to engage Asian Americans in shaping policy. And we have Kristen Nimmers, the Policy and Campaigns Manager for the California Black Power Network. So I will dive right into my first couple of questions. I'm going to combine some questions so that we can make sure we have time for audience Q&A. Could you, and I'll start with Luis, could you, and go down the row here. Could you talk about what are the issues that are impacting the communities that your group works with? Specifically, if your groups have done polling or have polling coming out, what are you seeing in those polls? What are the issues that you're tracking? So let's start with Luis.
Yeah, so first off, it's important to just understand for young people, just the diversity of this population, right? So in the next 4 years, aging millennials, because they're going to be they're already over 40 or close to 40, right? And Gen Zs will make up the largest voting bloc in California, right? So that's one thing. But more importantly, and just as important, is they're also the most diverse generation in the state and probably in the country, right? So 75% people of color, at least one of their parents, almost 50% have immigrant parent in their household, right? And then lastly, what's really, and it was kind of, the data panel spoke to this is, right, they're talking about in the data sense of it, right, but young people are moving, right? So there's an existential crisis that they're living with, which is, can I afford to live in the place I love? And can I afford to live in the place I grew up in, be it Los Angeles, be it Orange County, be it, the Bay Area, right? And so more often than not, young families and young people are moving inland or out of state. Right? So it's important to understand that. I think some of the data concerns and some of the realities around data is how do we keep up with folks as they move, and as they move into communities that are not really a reflection of the communities they left, right? Much more conservative, less open and welcoming. And then the other thing is just on the issues, right? So, I'll speak to a little bit more to the bold data a little bit, but in the next question, but, the issues that matter to young people, like for example, right now there's a narrative which is about democracy's at stake, and that's what's driving people to the election. Yes, there's an excitement about it, but what we've found from our polls, multi-year polls, is that is not the issue that drives them to the ballot box. It's really about what are the issues that matter to me, and then you as a candidate, are you speaking to them, right? Affordability, cost of living, the economy, the rise of inflation, and then just the reality that they're trying to make ends meet. So for example, one of the things we did, we've done 2 polls this year. The first part of the poll we did at the beginning of the year was about seeing young people in particular is like what identity they see themselves as. And as evidenced by them just emerging out of the pandemic and this moment is they see them mostly as caretakers and hustlers. And sometimes these identities actually are even seen more than their racial identity, right? And how they perceive. So part of it is, as voters, that's how they're going to come to the ballot box, and that's how they're going to come connected to the issues. And then the last thing is, it's all within the context of young people are just facing some dire consequences, be it this changing economy, the reality of like they can't afford to live here, and then lastly, the economy that they're trying to manage is impacting how they see the world, and it's all within. Most of them have emerged out of the Great Recession or out of the pandemic, right? And so they're trying to make sense of this all. So I'll end there, and then we'll just go to the next one. Yeah.
Great. So thank you so much. I also want to thank the Center for Inclusive Democracy for bringing us all together. We very much appreciate this opportunity. So our work is with the Latino community in California. We have several decades of experience of doing nonpartisan voter mobilization as well as polling. And I wanted to, when talking about polling in the Latino community, I wanted to start with what Matt said in the last panel, which is there's a lot of issues with how samples are taken, whether you get polled by somebody who can immediately talk to you in Spanish, if that's the kind of assistance you need. And so there's a little issue of the extent to which polling is reliable, but so when I talk about Latino community issues, I'm not going to necessarily put numbers on everything because the numbers really vary, but I'm going to talk about what we've seen, and then I'm also going to do a little plug for our polling, which is coming out Thursday. We're going to be releasing a California Latino voter snapshot poll Thursday morning. But what we've seen from good polling so far is for the Latino community, this election is about the cost of living, inflation, pocketbook issues. Over and over again, people talk about how much housing costs. Can they afford to pay for groceries? Can they afford to pay for their kids' college education, okay? This is really, this kind of bread and butter economic issues is really affecting Latinos, right? Because people not only talk about it being the most important issue, but they talk about how it affects their day-to-day lives. We do see some other issues that are relatively important. Women's reproductive rights and abortion rights is something that Latinos, not all, but many Latinos support. And then when everybody talks about the Latino community, you know, folks, what is the big issue everybody thinks drives the Latino community, right? They think it's immigration. Well, guess what? Immigration, people have strong feelings about it, but it is not in the top tier. And what we're seeing is that Latinos have very nuanced ideas about immigration, okay? Yes, many Latinos want to see relief for DACA recipients or dreamers. They want to see undocumented folks get a path to citizenship. You know, many of them support the parole in place program that the Biden administration unveiled. But you see that people also say, well, we want a mixed approach, right? We do think we need to do something about border security. We do think we need to do something about people who are smuggling in folks. So it's nuanced and mixed. But like I said, if we talk about top issues, really, we consistently see these pocketbook and economic issues being top of mind for Latinos for this election.
Yeah, lots of points we want to come back to. Kristen.
Yes, also thank y'all for inviting me. Our organization really works with Black voters and doing civic engagement among Black voters. And I think one of the things most impacting like participation or engagement in the election is targeted disinformation to Black voters. I think since around 2020, especially online, there has been targeted disinformation to Black voters. And there was this recent study that came out by this group called Onyx Impact. And their study found that more than 40 million Black people were targeted for disinformation about the election within Black online spaces. And so there's like narratives that are threatening Black voter participation as well, like folks not feeling like their votes matter. There's a lot of growing disillusionment among Black voters and a real need to instill hope in folks and to continue to impress upon folks the value of their vote and the impact that they are able to have on our elections. And then as far as polling, we recently did a survey with 1,300 Black voters within California, particularly asking about reparations, because that's also one of our top issue areas within California. And we found that reparations is really a motivating factor to vote, and folks are more likely to support candidates who have committed to supporting and trying to push forward reparations. And so that is also something that's key, both on the federal level, but also on the local level, because we've seen a lot of different growing local movements in counties, in cities, where they're starting to create their own commissions similar to the process that the state did to really identify like what are some recommendations, what are some systemic changes and reforms that we can make to address these past harms that we can connect back to slavery. And then also as a part of our poll, we as an organization focus on like 7 key issue areas that are most impacting Black folks. And so we also asked folks to rank those issue areas. And the number 1 issue for Black folks was economic opportunity, which I think relates similar to what Rosalind was just uplifting and what other folks have talked about as far as folks are really concerned about housing prices, and Black folks in particular in all major cities in California make up a significant portion of the house's community, 30 to 40% in LA, in San Francisco, in Oakland. And so economic opportunity is really connected to stability and folks still trying to recover from the impacts of the pandemic. Poverty has doubled for Black communities since like 2019, 2020. And so it used to be like 9% of Black folks within California were living in poverty, and now it's 18%. And so economic opportunity has really been the top issue for folks, and which also is creating some of that vulnerability to misinformation, especially about economic conditions and policies that have led to those economic conditions. And then beyond that, there's also public safety and criminal justice being number 2 concern for folks, which, since 2020, we've seen how much Black folks have been pushing for criminal justice reform, and how even on the upcoming ballot, there are a lot of policies that seem like they're potentially going to take us backwards, take us back to similar policies as the war on drugs, take us back to mass incarceration. And so that's also a top issue for folks and something that's top of mind this election.
Thank you. And Reshma.
Hi, everyone. So I'm with the Asian American Futures, and we had a poll come out recently in September. We took a look at California Asian American voters along with AAPI Force, a partner organization, AAPI Data. Asian American, 1/3 of all Asian American voters are in California, and so our numbers are really significant here. Like other communities of color, the pocketbook issues were number 1. So number 1 was jobs and economy, healthcare, inflation. Some of the other top 10 were climate and the environment, education falls in the top 10, and then community safety as well, but from the angle of anti-Asian violence, because there was such an uptick in violence during the pandemic and soon after, concerns about safety continue to bubble up over and over again. I think what's really interesting with Asian American voters is you have, obviously, it's such a diverse group by language, country of origin, communities. So there's not even necessarily like a feeling of solidarity between Asian American Pacific Islanders communities. And then when you kind of think about more broadly, there's space within the democratic ecosystem. People can really turn to insular sources of information, especially if there are language barriers. And that's been driving lots of misinformation and disinformation, primarily in the Chinese immigrant communities, but we're also seeing it in Vietnamese immigrant communities. And some of the top kind of disinformation messages out there around immigration, that actually the Biden-Harris administration has been bringing undocumented immigrants in to like steal the vote. There's misinformation around, some of the access to voting and whether, voting is legitimate. There's a lot of information circulating about the 2020 election and that it was illegitimate. And so it's, I think, very critical, for Asian American communities and particularly immigrant Asian communities, the misinformation, disinformation issues are huge. I just think the other thing I'd like to point out is, because we have an immigrant generation and then we have a US born generation or generation that came here much younger, they're actually a very quickly growing proportion of the population, and most of them are under the age of 40. And this is a group that we found actually the same as older immigrants as well, but for various reasons. There's definitely a sense of lack of belonging, lack of connection, our voice doesn't matter. For older voters, I think what's happening is this driving into misinformation, disinformation. For younger voters, they're just kind of opting out, and we call it really the values to action gap, which is our polling actually found that overwhelming majorities of Asian American voters are in agreement on many of the issues that I think many of us in the room care about, whether it's around economic security or housing or even some of the pieces around driving resources to communities rather than with law enforcement. But we find either that we can't activate folks to actually vote or get involved, or when it becomes very local to them or their communities, the term that we use is we get wedged, which is for that particular issue, then like we're gonna fight against affirmative action. We're gonna fight against, housing in our local community, because when push comes to shove, our values is not translating into action. And so we're trying to better understand that as well within kind of the broader political ecosystem.
Yeah, I think as a reporter, that's what I find exceptionally interesting is the diversity, but the nuance within the diversity of California. There's so much that all of these different groups and within groups have in common, but also a lot of variation. So I'm curious about digging in a little further to the polls. And Luis, I think you wanted to expand a bit. Were there specific issues, races, ballot measures, things like that that you polled on, and what did you find especially interesting? And also feel free to jump in. Yeah.
I mean, part of just to a little nerd on our methodology, because I think it's important, is first off, we want to make sure in our polling, because we've been doing a poll as Power California with young people in California since 2018, right? So we've done it every election, essentially asked the same question so we could kind of track data. But what we've done is, in particular, to make sure we reflect as young people are moving, is we've oversampled Black voters in the state of California, because a lot of them are moving to places like Antelope Valley, East Contra Costa, or IE, right? From the Bay Area and LA area, right? Second, we wanted to make sure that we oversampled fishhook parts of the state, like the Central Valley, right? So we have deep data from those regions. That's not just like a region, but also racial deep. So you could talk about API communities that live there, Black communities, Latino communities, right, across the region. And then lastly, what we've also done is make sure that within that data set, that we have enough samples from key regions in the state, right? i.e. Los Angeles County, Bay Area. So we could really reflect some of the diversity in thought, but also some of the values that are kind of emerging, right? So first of all, what we found is there's definitely a move amongst young people, even over the last 2 and 4 years, of the wrong direction California is going in, right? So young people have actually historically been in our polling much more positive than other voters, right? Now they're about 50% are saying now, about 48 statewide, depending on the community, is saying California's going in the wrong direction. The biggest one, this is why the sampling is so important, and this kind of reflects probably the potential for a lot of the swing districts that are happening in the Central Valley. So in 2022, actually Central Valley only 34% felt California was going in the wrong direction. They had the biggest jump, 15 points this time, from 22 to 24 to 49%, right? So just showing how is that going to play out in swing districts? Because 2 of the 4 or 5 key congressional districts that may flip Congress come out of the Central Valley, right? And so that's kind of a reflection of that. The other thing is that we found that despite the uncertainty of the stress and the economy, that they actually 50% feel that it's going to get better for them. So they have this general positivity, which has always existed in our poll. It's just this time they just feel in this moment, it's not moving in the right direction, but they actually have a feeling like it will get better, right? And part of it is that's why they're motivated to fight for these issues, right? And I think this generation of young people in particular, there's this counter narrative, which is both about they're not engaged, they're disengaged, they're apathetic, right? But also we all know from just the hard data of how many more young people have been on the streets since 2016, right? Be it around immigration, the Trump election, be it just the movement around ceasefire recently, reproductive justice and the Dobbs decision, criminal justice and the climate justice, right? And so the numbers keep going up. The amount of young people we poll that have engaged or participated in an action around any of those sets of things, right? It goes as high as 20% to 19%. So the reality is, how do we translate, and this is kind of the issue we talked about here, people who are value aligned, but then they don't trust the system, which our poll clearly shows, right? But yet they've shown enough interest. Because you would say, if you're willing to go protest something, you've actually jumped that gateway of first I register to vote, and then I do this, and I do that. Most people do like go to city council meeting or protest as the third act, right? Not as the first act, right? And so part of it is we're trying to figure out what would be the motive for us to get them from being folks who are actually active in social movements, but getting them to do the job of voting, right? And part of it is, many young people just feel that too often than not, even though they think voting is important, they feel that it doesn't translate to real change in their lives, daily lives, right? And part of it is, this is just reflective of the economic security that they're feeling right now. 1 in 4 have thought about leaving the state, taking a second job or postpone their bills. 1 in 5 young people are supporting friends or family. This is kind of part of the caretaker hustling thing that we're talked about, because since the pandemic, the work they've had to do. And then 40% of them blame low wages on their lived experience right now, right? And then in particular, if you look at the disparity amongst these numbers, so for young Black and Latino Californians struggling more than their peers, so even 14% more are more likely to have a second job or report postponing bills, right? And then 1 in 5 young Black Californians have moved back with their own family, right? So these are like realities that they're dealing with, and this economic insecurity is actually moving around like housing, the economy. It's kind of feeling like, well, who's going to represent our interests and who's going to represent our issues, right? And so, those are just things that we have to look at. And then the other important things is what is aligned, and actually I think this is really reflective of a lot of because people say, there's a narrative around like, there is like, oh, people are against progressive policies, that's why cities are flipping, right? But I also feel that there's also an anti-incumbent energy that exists across cities, across the state, and where people just feel that the elected officials, because in our polling, what it's been, before they used to blame other folks, right? They would say, in our previous one, they would say, the reason there's a problem is because my neighbors. The reason there's a problem is because the last 2 polls we've done is they've made a more direct line. I'm facing these issues in my neighborhood because the elected official is not delivering, right? And that's a very different through line that has existed in our 2018 or 2020 polling. It began to kind of show itself in the 22 poll, but in particular in 24, and I really feel that that's reflective of a lot of the change that's happening in cities and around challenging who's in office, and then and then meeting the needs. And then the last thing that I think is important is just understanding, like right now, 88% believe that corporations are getting richer every day while people struggle, and then 90% believe that the system as benefiting billionaires and greeting corporations, right? So there is a level of like making these connection points that young people are doing that they weren't making before. A lot of it, we believe, is being driven by their better understanding of the housing crisis, when everything else is much more nebulous for them, right? But when the housing crisis came about, and it's been part of the national conversation and local conversations, young people are making connections like they were never before. Yeah.
I'm curious, yeah, has that been?
I just wanted to talk about 3 constellation of issues that we're seeing pretty consistent in polls on the Latino community. And again, I'm going to not always be precise with numbers because there's a lot of polls out there. Let's go to one thing that I bet you a lot of you are interested in, which is presidential candidate preferences, okay? Well, generally the polls are showing in California that Latinos favor Kamala Harris over Trump, but the differences in how much the Latinos support their Trump, there's a significant, sizable number. It can be anything from in the high 20% to the low 30% in these polls. There is that support. There is a solid core, if you want to call that, numbers of Latinos who support Trump for president. And the support for Harris is probably anything from, mid 40s, maybe up to 60 in that range. When another consistent thing we say is that much of the support for Trump is being driven by Latino men, okay? That Latino women tend to favor Harris more over Trump than Latino men do. Another thing that we've seen consistently through a lot of the polling is that there is more voter enthusiasm when Harris, you said when Harris became the nominee, did you get more interested in the election? And we're consistently seeing that. So that's one constellation issue. The second constellation of issues is how do Latinos in California cast ballots, okay? And we're seeing, again, very consistency that Latinos like to cast ballots in a variety of ways. Some prefer to go to a vote center. Some prefer to vote by mail. Some prefer to go to their local precinct site. So that, what this teaches us is that if we're going to be mobilizing Latinos, then we are going to need to do a lot of education about all the options in California. Finally, and this finding is one that is just a real lesson to people who do voter mobilization, the surveys are showing that about half of Latinos, at least half of Latinos, have not been contacted by a political party, a candidate or an organization about registering to vote or voting, okay? California is not considered a battleground state, even though we have a lot of very exciting, contests going on. But plus that, because many Latinos are not frequent voters, right, and that's who the candidates and the parties go after, they are being ignored by political parties and candidates and organizations. So I think this is something we've consistently seen not only in polling for this election, but throughout other elections in California.
Yeah. Kristen and Reshma, I'm interested in further polling, further issues, as well as maybe like what you think would engage communities. Kristen, like you mentioned, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. How do you bridge that? How do you get the right information out there? So maybe, Kristen, if you could start with that.
Yeah, I think similarly, folks were energized by Kamala coming into the race, but I think that was mostly like older Black folks who are more likely voters, and them seeing it as an opportunity to participate and support in like the making of history. Like I know folks who have already bought tickets to Washington to like watch the inauguration and things like that. They're that excited. But there's still lots of work to do in communities that are most impacted by these other social issues. So we've already mentioned it, but like communities are feeling the pain of inflation, the impact of increasing climate disasters, increasing racism and attacks on Black communities and other communities of color via these attacks on DEI and critical race theory that isn't even really in elementary schools, and all of these other attacks. And there's like increasing frustration as well with like foreign policy and our participation in ongoing wars, and not just in relation to like the merits of like who's right or wrong in these foreign conflicts, but also in the merits of the level of investment and the billions of dollars that are going to weapons rather than to these issues that folks are feeling. And so to Luis's earlier point, folks don't feel that there has been tangible shifts that they can feel and see in their lives, and therefore are translating that to my vote really isn't impacting anything and it doesn't matter. And so that disillusionment has really impacted things. And I know this isn't necessarily a democracy issue, but I think one of the things that would really help impact is like trying to pass more policies that get folks out of survival mode. Like, this ongoing displacement, for example, means that many people have moved in the last few years, and all of these things are really impacting whether or not folks are motivated to vote or can even focus on voting. And so there's that. I'll stop there. Those are those main pieces.
I would like to hear more, but let's go to Reshma, and maybe we'll have time to circle back. Yeah.
Well, maybe, I'll talk kind of about some of the trends that we're seeing. In terms of polling and what we found about support for Kamala Harris, Asian Americans support her at about 66%, and there was a huge jump after Biden stepped away. And so I think there's both a lot of resonance around having, an Asian American and Black candidate, and we've seen a lot of excitement in the South Asian community particularly, and those numbers have increased as well. Asian Americans, for the most part, have been pretty reliably Democratic voters, not as much as Black communities, for example, but definitely up there. And some subsets of Asian Americans, certain South Asian communities, Filipino communities, et cetera, are more heavily Democratic than others. Chinese Americans and Vietnamese Americans have lower numbers. And there are, even though many voters say they haven't been contacted by either political party, we are seeing some picking off of Asian American men particularly, by the right, by regressive forces. And I think we're seeing that in other communities as well. So I think it's a trend that we share and something we're keeping our eye on. I think the other thing is just the multiplicity of strategies you need to reach such a diverse community. And so with the misinformation and disinformation with immigrant voters, there's lots of organizations out there really doing good work, getting trained influencers to kind of step in, to combat the misinformation, to be spokespersons, to write op-eds, to go on the in-language media. So really like shoring up the in-language media and making sure that it's factually based, and then having representatives speaking factually about elections, what's true, what isn't true is really important. And we're seeing both more organizations and I think more localities deploying that. I think the other, in places like Orange County, Silicon Valley, others that actually have like these pluralities of Asian American voters, there really has to be ways to speak to people's values in terms of what they care about. We actually have been doing some work in Orange County along with a couple of other partners like Viet Rise, et cetera, to really look at how we can, say, use social media, influencers, people who don't normally talk about politics, perhaps a food blogger or fashion writer, to talk about some of these ballot initiatives or political scenarios and move voters. And so really trying to get at them in as many ways as possible. And I think Orange County is actually a good example of a place where we have seen a real move rightward. And that has been because of the concerted effort of the right in organizing our communities. And so we have a lack of investment. Asian Americans, I think, have been seen as a smaller community, yet we're the most quickly growing demographic. And so there's a lot to lose by not investing in, our political mobilization, our political consciousness. And so, organizations like ours and many others are really working on that. And then there's just one last thing I wanted to say before I pass it on. Which is that when we think about these, new ways of voting, of engaging people, I think, starting with youth in high schools and colleges, because some of what we're seeing, particularly in California, I think some of the younger voters who maybe are disengaged, and this is perhaps a challenge for Asian American communities more so than others, which is we have a big swath of people that are kind of in the middle classes and and economically kind of upwardly mobile or come from middle class or upper middle class families. And they might be in places like San Gabriel Valley or Orange County or Silicon Valley with many of their peers, and they hold kind of similar ideas. There's no grassroots groups touching them. So even though they're not necessarily the base and they're not necessarily the ones that need to drive a political agenda, their hearts and minds need to be touched and moved, because otherwise they're the ones who end up like fighting back against affirmative action, calling for the police to come to businesses. And so we have to think about our communities both in terms of like the base that we need to engage and organize, but also the hearts and minds we need to move so that we can have a large swath of people that are with us on all the issues that we care about.
Yeah.
2 more minutes until Q&A.
Sure, sounds good. I wanted to offer up anyone else who had thoughts on what else needs to be done to engage the people who feel very disillusioned with the system. Yeah, Kristen.
I feel like there's a lack of investment and prioritization of democracy, which I think is hard because we're also competing with all of these other issues. Like there's a housing crisis, there is all of these other crises that are really being prioritized for budget and for bills and things like that. But there is really a lack of investment and prioritization as a state in democracy. And we have to really be working to, like, we've changed a lot of our election systems, but so much of that happened over the pandemic. And now we're out of that. And a lot of folks still don't necessarily know about things. And we're not necessarily increasing accessibility for the most marginalized communities and investing in the education of those communities. Like for census outreach, there were specific partners that we're working to reach the hardest to reach communities, and that's including our unhoused folks, that's including immigrants who needed language access, and really impressing upon those folks like, why is the census important and things like that. But we don't have those same sorts of investments at the state level when it comes to elections. And I think the other piece is, I feel like some other folks mentioned, I think maybe Rosalind mentioned, like how folks are really not engaged if they're not likely voters. And one of our priorities as an organization is integrated voter engagement, which is engaging voters not only during election years in those few weeks before an election, but even in off years. Like every single year we are consistently engaging voters, because they have to understand that this continues, that civic engagement is not just like a one-time thing on election day, but is a long-term thing that we are all doing. And folks really need to kind of see the pathway to how their vote is actually making an impact. Like, you didn't just vote on this day, but this was the result of that election. This is how you could be involved in implementation. This is how it impacts all of these other issues that you care about and that are important to you, and how you can stay engaged in the long term to really impact the change that you want to see. And then the last thing I'll mention in relation to like investment is we also are not, like, in terms of prioritizing the most marginalized communities, like one of the other big things that we're concerned about is voting in jails and improving implementation of voting in jails, because we don't often talk about incarcerated folks, but there are thousands of folks who still today have the right to vote because they're still awaiting trial, because they've only been convicted of a misdemeanor and things like that. And this year there was a bill, AB 544, which the governor also just vetoed, and that would have cost less than, I think, $1 million annually after like a starting cost of like a little over $1 million. And so for some $100,000 a year, we could have created polling places within prisons to make sure that those folks are also being able to exercise their right to vote, but it isn't a priority for investment. And so there's just really a need to continue to impress upon, you know, the governor and our legislature how important it is to invest in these democracy issues if we want to change these voter turnout gaps.
And I just wanted to quickly address, you know, within the Latino community, our past research has shown about the people who are not engaged. There's two constellations and they do overlap, but there's one group of people who they're very knowledgeable about politics, but they do not see a connection between political participation and change in their day-to-day life. They don't feel that their vote will make a difference in who the elected officials are and in the ability to get elected officials who are accountable to them. So they are, like I said, knowledgeable about politics and interested, but they are not engaged because this disconnect between political participation and change their life. The other constellation are people who actually, you know, are interested in participating, but they need information. We have a bilingual hotline, and most of the, for voting and things about citizenship and naturalization, when it's election time, most of our calls are about the basics. How do I register to vote? Where's my nearest vote center? Am I going to get a vote by mail ballot in the mail? And what do I do if I don't get one? You know, so that, you know, we call it, you know, invitation plus information equals participation. And we've got to do a lot more on the invitation and information side to get that participation.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would want to add, because I think we've kind of been touching on this. One of the other groups that we actually overpolled is, for the last decade, we've been doing voter reg and IV work in these communities with BIPOC communities, and by and large, numbers have gone as high as 65% sometimes, 50% who are registering, decline of state, no party preference, right? So there's just a reality of a lot of these young, so you're talking about for a decade, so much more, right? And so there is, not only are they younger, not only, and even when we talk about some of these core communities, right? Latinos by and large are the youngest population, immigrants are the youngest population in California. So not only are they the least connected, but then parties and organizations are not reaching out to them in the same way, right? Because, and then in this time of, like, you know, we say like we have a divided United States, right? Is campaigns are using what's called ideology score to focus on turning out their bases, right? So if you're a no party preference, you know, a decline of state voter, you're not going to fall within their ideology score of bringing out your base first. And in many ways, this is where, you know, Kristen talks about democracy, right? When you don't engage people, or you, in a way, you're kind of making sure they don't turn out, right? In a way, so, and so part of it is it's incumbent upon us is how do we make sure, like, Kristen spoke to like integrated voter engagement strategies that we need to know. We know for sure, for example, we always go by this data point, and I live this in my own experience, right? If a young person is registered to vote by the age of 18 or 19, whichever was your first year, you could actually register on your first state or national election, and you vote twice, you become a habitual voter. Essentially, you vote like a senior, a baby boomer, a Gen Xer. If not, you disengage to your 30s, right? And I have that experience. Like, I know I did that, but I also have a whole set of cousins who didn't start voting till they're like 35, or 40, right? If they started, right? And so I think part of it is just understanding like this work of voting, it starts where young people in particular are much more stable in their lives. That's why I think like when we talked about vote at 16 or reaching young people, because like it's easier to teach someone like, especially as you think about most voters in California, I consider we're like first gen voters, right? Highly immigrant. You think about enfranchisement just in the state of California, in the United States, like how many generations have given us the right to vote as people of color, right? Like I was born in a community that didn't really enfranchise in Boyle Heights. Like, Roybal got elected. Like I walked precincts down Boyle Heights that really didn't exist till 1955. Right? 1940s and 1955, right? So people couldn't even vote, right? And these are places where laws started passing before, right? Start thinking about, so I think part of it is like understanding these realities, and this cultural relevancy is the importance about like, they need multiple touches, they need multiple conversations, and we need to make sure we're engaging young people younger and our communities faster.
One way that we've been doing that is through reparations. So we are also one of the co-conveners of the Alliance for Reparations, Reconciliation, and Truth. And it is a multiracial alliance because we know that like reparations cannot be passed alone by Black folks. And I feel like the thing that has really helped and worked most in that alliance is highlighting how much these issues are intersectional. Like I think folks might think of reparations and only think of compensation because it's just been kind of like sensationalized in the media, or only think of, Black folks, but so many of the issues that are impacting Black folks are also impacting other communities of color, other low-income folks within the same communities that we share. So for example, our executive director often talks about how historically we have less public pools because they started to close pools once they were integrated and Black folks could go to those. And so the consequence of closing those pools was not only that like Black folks don't have access, but also this whole community now doesn't have access to these public pools. And that's similar in a lot of the recommendations that came out of the reparations task force, where it's like, we need more investment in education and our students go to the same schools together. Prop 6, which is gonna be on the ballot to end slavery in California, it's not only Black folks that are incarcerated. And so like just continuing to highlight how intersectional our issues are has really enabled us to bring folks together. But I think it's also difficult because none of our communities are a monolith, like not even the Black community is a monolith, and there isn't an agreement in all of these policy areas on like how we should move forward. So that we don't have a solution to yet, but.
I would just say that, I really want to emphasize what Kristen said, which is that you heard themes that are common to all of our communities, right? So we may not do this specifically in the voter engagement place, but there's like this kind of osmosis of when we talk to people about, one of the reasons you should vote is because you want to get elected officials who address the issues that you're interested in, and there's kind of a reverberation that these are the issues that affect all of our communities' day-to-day lives. I do want to mention a place where we actually do work very closely together. You heard Cotton from the last panel talk about redistricting, okay? So given California's diversity, when it is time to figure out how we're going to draw lines in California that respect the interests of all of the diverse communities, that provide a fair opportunity for all of our diverse communities to elect candidates of their choice, we have to have hard discussions together on things like unity mapping, on how do we create these districts, how do we make sure that all of the communities of interest are respected. And that has, like I said, a ripple effect through the other work that we do. but it's hard. It is not easy work. It's very tough.
Can I say something just very briefly? I know we're running out of time. For the Asian American community, I think this issue is particularly important because we're often held up as the model minority, and the right particularly really uses us as an example of, well, if they can do it, why can't everybody else? And in fact, I wrote an op-ed with Rinku Sen, who runs the Narrative Initiative in the San Francisco Chronicle a few weeks ago about this, so if you want to look it up. But I think for our communities, it's actually really important both. So some of the things that, where I think we have kind of gone against other communities of color or said, like, this isn't in our interest, are things like education, public safety, and others. And we're finding both through message testing and some of the work that we're doing that we both have to kind of demonstrate what the self-interest is, because we have to see ourselves in the future of this democracy, that it's for us too, it's for our children too. So how do you kind of create that vision while building the unity, I think, which you were talking about, which that's often so difficult because our community has been pitted, even like the Korean community and Black community. And so we've had to do that real healing work. We're part of the reparations task force. And some of what we're really interested in kind of looking at is seeing, what moves Asian Americans on reparations, given that it is really an issue of solidarity and that, our voices are important in this fight too.
I just wanted to mention again, with the generous partnership and support of both the Haas Fund and the Irvine Foundation, Thursday, October 3rd at 9 a.m., we are going to be releasing the results of our California Latino Voter Snapshot Poll, a representative sample of California Latinos, as well as some oversampling in regions and by income. Please, we'll try to get the information out there about what you need to do to register, but it's going to be very exciting. So October 3rd, 9 a.m. And also we'll record it so that people can, we'll send it a follow-up with a recording so you can see it if you can't make it to the webinar.
Why don't we do this? When we send out the recordings and information about today, we'll send out the links to all of the polls.
Great.
Yeah.
And panelists will get those to us. So
Great.
everybody online and in person who's registered will get that information. Sound good?
That's great. Thank you. I know we were only able to touch the surface of all of these community issues, but thank you all for taking part in that discussion.
Thank you all very much for sticking with us through a full day, especially with a special session of the legislature happening across town. Again, all of the recordings, recording complete for the full event, as well as individual recordings for each of the sessions, presentations, panels, will be available soon. Just really value the conversation, both online and in person, and the partnership that you all have given us today, and all give each other. I know many of you work together on a regular basis, so it's great to see that. We are closed, and maybe most importantly, considering partnership and camaraderie, we've got a reception next door. Sorry for those of you online. Some hors d'oeuvres and drinks, so please join us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day and week.